So here we are at the last objective of Unit 8. And if you really think about it, this actually is almost the same thing as Objective 4. You're solving for trig equations, only this time we're solving in units of radians instead of degrees. But that's really the only thing that's different. So you're going to want to have your triangles nearby. And notice I have them in both, the degree and the radian equivalency, but we're going to be using the radians in Objective 9. So let's start. Let's start solving this. We could factor out a 5 if we wanted to, but you really don't have to. So let's just move the 5 to the other side. So we'd have 5 tangent theta equals negative 5. Now I'm going to divide both sides by 5. And now we have our equation tangent theta equals negative 1. Well, at this point, we need to get our reference angle. So that's why I said you want to make sure you have your triangles nearby. Which triangle has a tangent value of negative 1? Tangent is opposite over adjacent. You're really not going to get negative 1, but you are going to get positive 1 right here at the pi over 4, because opposite is 1, adjacent is 1, so 1 over 1 is 1. So we know the reference angle is pi over 4. But the negative is also playing a role. The negative is telling us what quadrants we're actually in. So where is tangent negative? Well, all students take calculus, so we're actually in quadrant 2 and quadrant 4, because tangent is positive in quadrant 1 and quadrant 3. So we're in quadrants 2 and 4. So with that in mind, let's draw the terminating rays. Pi over 4, it's the same thing as 45 degrees, but we have to think of it in terms of radians. So it is 45 degrees. Your reference angle is always to the horizontal. So the reference angle is pi over 4 right here, and it's pi over 4 right there. So what are those real angles? Well, if you go all the way over, this would be 4 pi over 4, because 180 degrees is the same thing as 1 pi, but we didn't quite get there, so 4 pi over 4 minus 1 pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. So one of my answers is 3 pi over 4. But there's a second answer. Let's go all the way around. If this is 4 pi over 4, then this would be 8 pi over 4, which is reduced down to 2 pi. So if we think of going all the way around as 8 pi over 4, but we have to subtract a pi over 4 because we didn't quite make it, we would be at 7 pi over 4. And that would be your two answers to that problem. Let's go down to the next one. 2 cosine squared theta minus 1 equals 0. Okay, let's move the minus 1 to the other side. So we'd have 2 cosine squared theta equals positive 1. Divide both sides by 2. So now we'd have cosine squared theta equals 1/2. Now I have to take the square root. Now, taking the square root does a couple of things. Number one, it gives me plus and minus as my answer, so I know I'm going to be in all 4 quadrants. But it would be the square root of 1, which is still 1, over the square root of 2. So cosine theta equals plus and minus 1 over square root 2. So let's go back to our triangles again. Which triangle has a cosine value of 1 over square root 2? Well, it happens to be the pi over 4 again, because cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so 1 over square root 2. So it's pi over 4, which is our reference angle. So our reference angle equals pi over 4. And as we said earlier, we're in all 4 quadrants. So if you want to visually see what's going on, we can take care of that rather easily. Take care of those 2 quadrants right there, and we can take care of these 2 quadrants right there. And pi over 4 is our reference angle. So this is pi over 4, that's pi over 4, that's pi over 4, and that's pi over 4. So my 4 answers to this problem are theta equals pi over 4, and remember, this would be 4 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 would be 3 pi over 4, just like before. Now this one would be 4 pi over 4 plus pi over 4, so 5 pi over 4. And this one would be all the way around, which would be 8 pi over 4 minus this pi over 4 right here, so 7 pi over 4. So for this particular problem, there are actually 4 answers. Okay, my next problem, 3 tangent squared theta minus 1 equals 0. Well, you already know there's going to be 4 answers because it's a tangent squared problem. And if you're still a little bit in the dark as to why, let's start solving this problem by moving this -1 over to the other side, and we'd have 3 tangent squared theta equals +1. Now let's divide both sides by 3. Tangent squared theta equals 1 over 3. Now here's where we're going to get all 4 answers. We're now going to take the square root. When we take the square root of this, it's going to give us plus and minus answers. So tangent theta equals plus and minus. Now the square root of 1 is still 1, but the square root of 3 is simply square root 3. And that tells us we're in all 4 quadrants, because 2 of my answers are going to come from the positive quadrants, and 2 of my answers are going to come from the negative quadrants. So we really don't have to figure out what quadrants are we in. We just have to figure out what's the reference angle that has a tangent value of 1 over square root 3, and that's where we go back to our triangles again. Which of these triangles has a tangent value of 1 over square root 3? Tangent is opposite over adjacent. And this is it right here, the pi over 6. In degrees, it's 30 degrees, but in radians, it's pi over 6. Opposite over adjacent is 1 over square root 3. So my reference angle is pi over 6. And we've already talked about we are in all 4 quadrants. So if you want to get a visual of what that looks like, it would look something like this. Okay, so there we go. Each one of those angles is a pi over 6 angle. Now, if we go all the way over to 180 degrees, that would be 6 pi over 6. If we go all the way around again, we'd be at 12 pi over 6. So where are these angles? Well, the first one is simply pi over 6. Okay, but what's the next one? Well, it's 6 pi over 6 minus pi over 6. So it would be 5 pi over 6. What would be the next one? Well, it would be all the way over to 6 pi over 6 plus a pi over 6. So that would be 7 pi over 6. And then the final one would be going all the way around the circle. So 12 pi over 6, but actually having to backtrack by pi over 6. So subtract. 12 pi over 6 minus pi over 6 would be 11 pi over 6. And those would be the 4 answers to that problem. All right, let's do one more. Okay, I don't have a square in the problem, so I'm going to end up with 2 answers. First step, simply move that 1 to the other side, and it would become a negative 1. Second step, divide both sides by 2. So the cosine of theta equals negative 1/2. Next step, figure out what your reference angle is. What triangle has a cosine value of 1/2? Here are the 3 triangles. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So, adjacent over hypotenuse, 1/2. So it's a 60-degree angle, but in radians, it's pi over 3. So my reference angle is pi over 3. Now, where are we? Where is cosine negative? All students take calculus, so cosine is positive in 1 and 4, so it's negative in 2 and 3. So, those are our terminating rays, and this one isn't quite drawn right, but we don't need them to be drawn right. We just need to know that reference angles are always from the horizontal. So, if this is 3 pi over 3, right here, then this would be 2 pi over 3, because I went 3 pi over 3 minus pi over 3, so theta would equal 2 pi over 3. Now the other one would be, I made it all the way halfway to 180, or I made it to 180, which is 3 pi over 3, and then I went pi over 3 more, so 3 pi over 3 plus pi over 3 is 4 pi over 3. And that would be the 2 answers to that problem.